Part one is a conversation in a social context between somebody who might be phoning up to book some tickets for a theatre production, they might be phoning up to book a holiday, something like that. It's the least demanding part of the test. The candidates might have to fill in a form and get the correct spelling of particular words. Part two is a monologue. It's somebody who could be, for example, explaining how to get from one place to another. It's slightly more difficult in terms of complexity than the first part. Part three is where it moves on. It's a discussion. Up to 4 people are involved in the discussion, but it is always in an academic context. It's between a lecturer and a student or 2 students. And then it moves on to part 4, which is the most demanding part of the listening test. This is a lecture. Again, it's a university type context, and a lecturer is talking about a particular topic or a particular subject. It's the only part of the listening test where the students aren't given a break to read through all the questions with a huge amount of time. There's only a pause in the entire part 4. It is the most demanding part of the test, and students who are looking for a higher score, that's where they're going to be challenged the most. It is the easiest part of the test, and a lot of the time students who are at a lower level, this is the part where they can really start getting the scores on the board that they actually need. It tests essential things like, can you take down a telephone number correctly? Now, it could be that a particular number is said 0771 or 0771, something like that. But the things that tend to trip students up at this level are the lower level students who maybe can't quite get the numbers as they're being said, or they kind of misspell something as it comes out. In Mindset, there are lots of examples of how a part 1 format might go and the sort of things that lower level students have to practice. There's lots of practice for them. One big important thing for a teacher to do, if you've got a student who is at a higher level and expecting a higher score, the 10 questions in part 1, make sure that your student goes into that exam and they are focused from the start. I've had quite a few students who are really quite high level, but they go into the exam and think, because part 1 is easy, I'll just do this, and they kind of switch off a bit, and they lose marks. A question in part 1 is worth the same amount as a question in part 4, and it's just basic exam technique that, okay, they might be easier, but get them done, because you don't get any more credit for getting a question right in part 4 as part 1. They're all worth the same. What happens in part 2 is that it tests students' ability to listen to a slightly more extended spoken passage, and there are more skills that are being brought in there, and this is where you get more distractors being thrown in, and that's a really, really important word for a teacher to know when they're teaching arts, and it's a really important word for a teacher to get across to the students. You are not just listening for individual words in a test. Some tasks that you may have to fill in the gap with a word, but there's always going to be things that the person says on the audio that are there to throw you off the scent, that are there to confuse you. For example, you might have a question that asks you to fill in a gap, and that gap seems to be the name of a particular course at university. So it could be, I don't know, Greg wants to study gap at university. You can get your students to predict the answer. You can get them to think, well, what could it be? It's obviously going to be a particular subject of study. But you can be sure that when they hear the audio, it won't just be that one. It won't just be one area of study. It could be another 2 or 3 mentioned. And they're there to distract the student. They're there to distract the candidate and make them think, okay, well, that was the answer. But what it does is it tests your ability to closely listen to what's being actually said, because paraphrase is another big thing, and the question will often be a paraphrase of what's actually said. They're making sure that you are listening to what's being said to get the right answer, and not just write a word into the answer just because you've heard it and it seems to fit. This is where you have to understand how people agree with one another or disagree with one another. So lots of practice with understanding how a dialogue will develop. Again, this is one thing that we see running through Mindset, that you get practice on the sort of phrases that people use, like you could be right, but, and that on its own, if you look at the idea of you could be right, Is that agreement or disagreement? And it's framing the fact that you need to be able to follow a discussion and how people's opinions are formed and what they're actually saying about things. There'll be distractors all over the place as you get further along the exam. There's distractor here, distractor there. One thing to also drill home to the students is that the questions, as you find them on the paper, they go in the order that you hear them in the audio. Question 31, 32, 33, that will be the order that you hear them in the test. It won't be the fact that it jumps around. So what you also need to do is to make sure that your students, because the questions run in order that you hear them, if they miss something, just move on, forget it. Forget that question entirely. You may have missed the point, you may have missed the mark, that's okay, just move on to the next one. It's about making sure that students have got that exam technique, that they don't sort of listen to something and think, hang on, was it this, was it that, what did I hear? Because all the while they're questioning what the answer was, the audio is moving along, and then they could miss the next one. So again, exam technique, if you haven't got it, forget it, just move on. Now that relates as well to part 4. What often happens in part 4, it's a long lecture. It's a good few minutes long. What often happens is that of all the questions, 2 of the questions, one answer will come very, very quickly after another. There might be a period of about 25 seconds where the person talking on the audio isn't actually saying anything that directly relates to the questions. And that's often a key to knowing that 2 answers are going to come quite quickly. It's quite difficult because it is listening to something over a prolonged period. It's not just listening to snippets. And it's a good test for developing their skills if they want to go on to university, because it does mimic that sort of lecture. They are going to get challenged in part 4, so you need to make sure that they can, if possible, mentally paraphrase something that they hear and that they read. If they get the questions, as they're looking through the questions, start to predict how a particular question might be phrased differently, because it could be that they will get close to what is actually coming out in the audio, or it could be miles away, but it just focuses them on, okay, I'm listening for something that's going to mean something like this. In my experience, all students do this before they've been instructed. When part 1 or part 2 or part 3, when each part finish and it's about to move on to the next, students just go straight on to reading the questions on the next section. And very often, particularly if it's sort of a summarising passage, or it's something that requires them to write a word rather than choose an option, they just turn the page and move on to the next section. That gap between sections is essentially there for them to check their answers, to have a look through it. It could be that they read through the passage that they think they've got right, but what they've got in the gap doesn't quite fit grammatically with what the answer should be. Don't waste any part of the exam. Don't immediately rush forward to the next. It's difficult with listening to check your answers because it's gone, but just a quick read through of each part before you move on to the next one. At the end of the listening test, there is time allocated to transfer your answers. And if you've checked in the first place that your answers are correct, then by the time you transfer them onto your answer sheet, then there's less chance of something going wrong. Write in capitals, write clearly, because certain parts of the listening test, they need to be absolutely clear what they're writing, and absolutely vital, correct spelling. So if a word is spelled incorrectly on the answer sheet, then it doesn't get the mark. So make sure that they practice that as well in class, transferring answers over to make sure that they don't rush through it too quickly and then they lose marks that they shouldn't. Make sure that the students read the question and see what the question is asking them to do. It could be that it's asking them to write 1 to 3 words and or a number in their answers, and they need to know that they're working within those confines. They can't just write as many as they want. There are particular parts of the test that say, do it like this. So make sure they have read the question, that they do it like that, because otherwise they're going to lose silly marks. The whole thing of this is it's testing your language skills. And that's the thing again with distractors. Distractors are there to test your language skills and to test your understanding, and to test that you have understood, you've listened to, and you've interpreted, you've paraphrased what's been said on the audio. You haven't just guessed and put down the first word that you've heard. You've actually understood what's being said, and you've shown your knowledge and your language skills. There will be a wide variety of accents that candidates are going to hear in the listening test from a variety of nationalities. Most generally, there'll be UK accent from the Americas, and accent from Australia, New Zealand. Some people find some accents more difficult than others. Help your students with a little bit of practice so they can understand the quirks of it. So in terms of how you develop the skills and sub-skills for listening in the classroom and with your students, well, the way that the test works means that you don't get you don't get situations where you have people talking over one another. So if you develop a student's ability to understand what's being said in terms of a particular chunk of language and where the prominence and the stress falls in each particular chunk and overall. Now, because of the way that English is as a language, it's a stress-timed language, the important information is the stuff that we tend to shine a light on by making it more prominent, by saying it a little bit louder, the word lasts a little bit longer. You're unlikely to get a situation in an IELTS test where the answer that they need comes as an unstressed part of the speech. It will be something that you need to teach your students to listen out for. So particularly at lower levels, where they're trying to understand every single word and hear every single word. That's what you want to get them away from. And this is something that we've built into Mindset. The essential skills and the patterns that you need to follow in the language. Listen out for the words that are stressed, listen out for the parts that are important because the speaker thinks they're important, is making them more prominent. Paraphrasing in your head of what's exactly being said. And as you get higher up and you start to expect a higher score, students need to be able to do that as they listen to something and paraphrase what's being said in their head and also on the question. And that's one thing that you get from Mindset. There is an online bank of activities and tasks that will help the students to develop those listening skills outside of the classroom. What is particularly good about it is that in the listening online skill set, it's a different topic to what you find in the printed book, but it practices the same skills, so it just gives another context for what they've been doing with you as a teacher, and then they can go away and practice those exact same subset of skills on their own in another context. And obviously, because they've got that material wherever they are, they control it. They can listen to it as many times as they want, whereas often in a classroom it's down to the teacher to say, right, we're going to listen to it once or twice. They can go backwards and backwards and backwards until they're happy that they've got it. And that's the good thing about giving that to them, that they can be the sort of the controller of their own learning.